Welcome to Behavioral Grooves, the podcast that explores human behavior through a behavioral science lens. My name is Kurt.
And I'm Tim. We like to explore why we do what we do with researchers, authors, and practitioners in a conversational setting so that you can improve the quality of your work and home life.
Yes, and it is also the podcast where you can see us try new and sometimes weird podcast experiments.
Yes, and we sometimes fail at those, but we sometimes succeed.
Yes, and I think we might have succeeded in this little podcast experiment we did, Tim. At least maybe succeeded for half of it.
Yes, and during the other half, well, at least we might have learned something.
Okay. All right. So we tried something new with this. We did a joint podcast where we interviewed another great podcaster, and that person then turned around and interviewed us. So you, our lucky listeners, get a twofer in this situation. You get to hear both.
So our guest and interviewer today was Kelly Leonard, who is the host of the great podcast called Getting to Yes and, presented by Second City Works and WGN in Chicago. For over 30 years, Kelly has worked at Second City Improv in all capacities, moving up to executive vice president. He's worked with such greats as Stephen Colbert, Tina Fey, Keegan Michael Key, Seth Meyers, and Amy Poehler. His book, Yes and, received rave reviews in Vanity Fair and the Washington Post.
Yes, and while that is all interesting, what intrigued us most is that he is the executive director of Insights in Applied Improvisation at Second City, and now co-leads a new partnership with the Booth School at the University of Chicago that studies behavioral science through the lens of improvisation.
I think I see what you're doing here, Kurt.
Yes, and I thought you might.
So for the first half of the show, you will hear us interviewing Kelly like one of our everyday normal podcasts. But then about halfway through the show, the tables get turned.
Yes, and that is where we get interviewed by Kelly.
Yeah,
See, I'm doing it again, Tim. Yes, and. Yes, and.
It's working. And that is where most of the listeners will probably just turn it off. I mean, honestly, who wants to hear us? You know?
Who wants to hear us being interviewed? I get it. All right. Well, Kelly had some really interesting questions and obviously did his research. So maybe people should stick around and listen to the whole episode, even when it's you and me having to give the answers.
Yes, and they should stick through to our grooving session, which is going to focus on how the principles discussed can be used to improve our lives.
Yes, and so with that, take a moment to buckle yourself in, take a long drink of Going with the Flow, and listen to our interview with and by Kelly Leonard.
Kelly Leonard, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thanks for having me, guys.
You know, this is going to be so much fun. We have this opportunity to interview you, and then you're going to flip the tables, and we're gonna be interviewed. So this will be fun for both of our audiences with we go.
And let's start with the speed round.
Yeah, we get to start. So we're going to start with a speed round. And so, coffee or tea? Which do you prefer?
Coffee.
There's not a hesitation at all. You're not. Oh my God!
I have one right now. A little iced coffee, if you can hear it. I know I've got it before.
There it is. Mm-hmm. There it is. Proof. Okay. Dinner with your favorite actor, sports star, or musician?
Easy. Musician. Do you want to know who?
Yeah.
Django Reinhardt.
Oh, Django Reinhardt. Oh, right? Man. Yeah. Of course, he'd have to come back from the dead, but that'd be okay. You know,
I think that's part of the implied question.
Part of the piece of it is like, hey, I get to talk to a ghost. Here we go.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
All right. We're going back to an old question that we used at the very beginning. Bicycle or unicycle?
Okay. I don't know how to ride a bicycle.
Okay.
My daughter could ride a unicycle and used to do so around the block. But yeah, I don't know how to ride a bike.
I think that's fantastic. I didn't ride a bike for the first time in my life until I was 13 or 14. And I didn't like it. And I just thought it was a way. I grew up on a farm with horses and was like, horses are so much easier than bikes.
And I grew up with 5 older brothers who could drive me around places.
That's even easier.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay, last speed round question. Can you study improvisation Or will the study of it, as Mark Twain said of dissecting a frog, kill it?
No, it won't. In part because improvisation is different than comedy, although it produces a lot of comedy. Improvisation, I think, is more akin to truth. And a lot of funny things are things that we find surprisingly true. So I think, it is very, very hard for someone to not enjoy their improv classes. And even more so, it's very likely that people will tell you that their improvisational training actually changed their life.
Wow. Like in sort of the meta way, like my whole life got better kind of thing?
Yeah, well, better, different. I mean, the way I characterize, because I really, I ran Second City for years and dealt with improvisation on stage. In the last 6 years, I've been working about improvisation off stage, the various ways it's applied in education, academia, all corporate, all that stuff. And the way I like to describe it is improvisation is human being practice. So, we understand that peak performers in all these different fields, right? The arts and in sports, they practice, and they don't just like scrimmage, they skills practice. Improvisation is a practice in listening and communicating and leading and following. All these things that we do every day that we don't practice. And I don't know about you guys, but when I think about re-entering the world that we've been shut off with for a year, it's going to be awkward as hell.
Yes.
Right? And so the need isn't going to be never greater than how do I have a conversation in person again? I mean, we were never good listeners. We've always, human beings, been bad listeners. Then social came and the noise got even greater. And then COVID came. So, I mean, I think we're at an all-time probably listening deficit that everyone should maybe try some level of improv training.
I love the idea of thinking of improv training as like human training, right? It's this idea of really, being able to listen, to being able to understand the person who is opposite of you when you're having that conversation or that interaction with them. And you are taking this to the next level. You're actually collaborating with the Booth School to do some study of this. So can you tell our listeners a little bit more about what that collaboration is and what are you guys actually trying to achieve?
Yeah. When I stepped down from my position at Second City producing day to day, I was kind of looking for the next thing that I wanted to do. And I had a year to figure it out. That's what my bosses said, find a year to find a bridge back in or a bridge out.
Okay.
And then I released my book, Yes And, which is about how we take improv principles into businesses. And when I was on book tour, and any author who says they don't do this, they're lying to you. You go to the bookstore to see if your book is on the shelf. And so I'm in all these different cities. Okay. And I'm looking at these business books and because I wrote a business book. I didn't read business books, but I wrote one. And I kept finding these books on the art of negotiation that all mention improvisation, but didn't go any deeper.
Okay.
And so I had this idea around what if we collaborated with an academic who is an expert in negotiation. And at this point, I don't think I knew what behavioral science was. I'm not reading that. I always read a lot of fiction. And I Google Chicago academic negotiation. I send an email to the 5 top academics who, I see on this list. 4 of them got back to me right away. I have conversations. They're into it. And this woman at Loyola is the leading candidate. And about a week later, Eugene Caruso at the University of Chicago is hey, I'm sorry, I'm late getting back to you. Do you still want to talk? So old Kelly would have not taken the meeting, but I'm in this Shonda Rhimes year of yes stuff with my midlife crisis I'm going through. Okay. And so I say, yeah, I'll go up there. And he goes, great. I'm going to invite my wife, Heather. I think she'd be interested in this as well. I get up there and I do my rap on improv. I talk about improv as being yoga for your social skills, or improv being loud, noisy group mindfulness, a practice in being unpracticed. Eugene could care less. He's completely checked out, checking his emails. Heather locked in. Heather, at that point, was running the Center for Decision Research at the Booth School, which her boss was Richard Thaler. And I knew the reason I knew Richard Thaler is because one of my good friends is Adam McKay, and of course Thaler was in Adam's film, The Big Short. So I was familiar with his work, and I'm and Heather's Kelly, what you're talking about in improvisation feels to me akin to what we study in behavioral science, and those two things have never been put together. Within like 3 months, Thaler greenlit the Second Science Project, which is a collaboration started at the University of Chicago with Second City that looks at behavioral science through the lens of improvisation and vice versa. So we do research. We created executive education programs. We actually created 3 orientation programs that are still at use at University of Chicago and the law school. And here, I'll give you an example, which not surprise you, or you'll see how it fits. So most people are familiar with the concept of yes and improvisation, but for those who aren't, in improvisation, we know that groups of people who are trying to make something out of nothing get nowhere by saying no. Seems obvious. They actually don't get that far by saying yes. They have to say yes and. They have to affirm and contribute in order to explore and heighten. Well, behavioral economics shows us that human beings' default setting is to what? Do nothing or say no. So yes and is just a nudge. Yes and is a nudge towards doing the thing. Yeah. And that's just a basic start. And there's more, right? You build upon it. So when we got all the sort of nerds from the University of Chicago, scholars, in a room together with my people, they were like, show us like a popular exercise. So we showed them yes and they're like, great. There's plenty of literature around gratitude and other stuff that would show that this makes sense. And then they asked the question, though, what happens when you have something intractable, a thing you can't yes and or agree on? And we're like, we don't know. And they're like, we don't know. And so fundamentally, we went away and kind of explored this in our universe and their universe. And for 4 years, we had a lab up there every single week. It's down now, but that's what we were doing. We're coming together. And so we made a discovery. It's basically a 4th pillar around yes and that last pillar is thank you because. And the idea here is if we need to stay in conversation with someone we fundamentally disagree with, the way we do that is first by thanking them for the piece of information. So their fear brain doesn't go off. They're feeling the gratitude there. And then the because part is crucial. We have to find something in what they said that is true to both of us. So the example I often use is if I'm dealing with parents of friends of my daughters who are anti-vax, and I am not anti-vax, but I need to stay in conversation with them for the sake of these relationships. I can say, thank you for sharing your fear of vaccinations because you care so much about your daughter, you don't want her to get hurt. Same thing with me. We have a space then to stay in this conversation. So we've been running this with thousands of people over and over again. And there's going to be a paper that comes out next year, and the results are very strong. We also ran it where only one person did the thank you because. And I would have thought that would not have worked, but it did. It kept people in the conversation longer. They felt like they were getting somewhere.
Wow. How did you discover this? How did you come to the thank you because? What bubbled that up as a possibility?
It was a collaboration between when the scholars had certain evidence that they'd walk in the room with, and then we would put it to practice in improvisational sessions and essentially experimentation. Improvisation is the scientific method, right? So we just experimented with language, we experimented with actions. And this is the there's no one route in this stuff. Sometimes the scholars will come with material, sometimes we'll walk in the door with something, and then someone else will present us with a problem. One of the scholars we work with up there is Nick Epley, who wrote a terrific book called Mindwise.
Yeah.
And Nick's work, I don't know. Nick's work is mostly about how we completely get it wrong. We misunderstand the situations we're in. And I don't know. I was thinking about this somewhat in preparation for our talk and somewhat just in I was daydreaming about life. I remember my first job, 16-year-old high school, and it was a Jewel grocery store in Wilmette. And I worked there for about a week. And I was like, this is barely contained chaos.
Wow.
Like people don't know what other people are doing. It's and then there was a source of liberation of going, but it's working. It's the same thing. Like how does this work where we're not constantly running into each other on the streets? But it works. So when Nick was sort of sharing all his research, rather than be just sort of like sad about the human condition, it actually inspired me to be like, hey, we do pretty well with how dumb we are.
Yeah. I love that concept. The idea that even with all of the faults, even with everything that we get wrong, for the most part, we go through our lives living pretty decent lives for most people. It's part of the human condition. It was one of the things that COVID really pointed out to me. Now, and granted, I don't want to there are people who this hit really hard, and there are lots of
systemic
stories
institutional
out there
problems.
that
Yeah.
are horrible. But if you look at the vast majority, at least of Americans, and you think about how, if you would have talked to them in advance of this and said, all of these things are going to happen, how are you going to respond? I know I would not have thought that I could have responded this well for this long, given everything that has gone on. And to your point that, we aren't the smartest all the time, right? We are definitely these creatures that have foibles and, all of the biases that we have. And yet we trudge through, and we trudge through actually in a pretty good way, or maybe our brains just can, tell us that we're doing this. And maybe that's all right as we think about this. And I didn't have a question after that. So
I got something. There's a behavioral science joke that I think fits here that Nick Epley tells in Mindwise, which is a man walks up to a riverbank and sees a man standing across the riverbank, and he yells, "How do I get to the other side of the river?" And the man yells, "You are on the other side of the river." That encapsulates to me everything we're talking about.
I was wondering, Kelly, if you wouldn't mind, you teed up this idea that the thank you because is the fourth pillar, right?
Yeah.
What can you quickly review the other three?
Yeah. So when we run the exercise, the yes and exercise, we pair up people and we tell someone, okay, person A, you're going to pitch a reunion. We're having a reunion for today's event. And person B, you're going to say no in as many different ways as possible to this person. And you do that for a minute. And then we sort of talk about how that felt. And then we reverse it. And the second person pitches. And the other person, their job is to say yes, but. And it's very funny because some people are like, that felt better. And some people are like, that felt worse. And we often say, yes, but is no with a top hat. That's all it is.
It's a Minnesota no.
It's a Minnesota
it truly
no, or
is a
Canadian
Midwestern
no,
kind of, that's nice.
And then we have them yes and everyone's ideas, and the reunions end up having sushi on the moon with like Graham Parsons playing. I mean, it's incredible. And the idea, what we know from, and this is from the theater where this emanated, is that the best scenes are ones that came from unlikely yes ands, where you just were forced into sort of saying yes to something. And we know this about creativity, right? Constraints are our friend inside that. Do you guys, I don't know, have you ever had Tim Harford on the podcast?
We have not.
He wrote this great book called Messy, and he has a great story about the jazz pianist Keith Jarrett. And Jarrett was playing in Cologne, Germany. He got there, and this teenager who sold out this place, the piano was trash. The piano was bad, and he wasn't going to play. And she convinced him to. And he said, okay, you've got to record it so that I can send this tape about how bad this concert went to future, promoters, so this won't happen again. That album went on to become the biggest selling solo piano jazz album, the Cologne concert, in the history of the music. And he was forced to play in the middle where it's most melodic. He banged on the pedals because they weren't working. And then he grunted a lot because he was like trying to make this thing work. And it's like, this is his signature sound that really got developed around this like terrible piano. And I just find that story to me says it all in terms of how truly we navigate ourselves when we're being our most creative selves. We say in improvisation, see all obstacles as gifts. And that is a difficult orientation, but one that will serve you well, especially I think has served those of us well who are doing okay during COVID by just, innovating day to day.
Yeah, I think that the piano was not only out of tune, but there were some keys that actually didn't work.
Yeah, keys that didn't work.
And that Keith Jarrett had to actually figure out what keys can I play in to avoid those particular keys so I don't have to hit those. And the immense amount of creativity with just a modest amount of planning was pretty remarkable. So I don't have a question, Kurt, but you're obviously sitting on a question that I just interrupted you with.
I love the idea of obstacles as gifts and thinking about that, because so often I think we get mired down in, oh my gosh, I have so many obstacles in front of me that I give up. I'm not going to go. And particularly as we think about business and various different people as they're looking forward, and small businesses in particular. And you can see, and again, not to keep coming back to COVID, but there are those businesses that they pivoted really quickly and really well. And some of them are doing much better than they ever did before, and others didn't. And is there I mean, beyond taking improv classes, are there other things that you have identified at certain individual personalities that do this better? Is there anything is it just by chance, or is it something that is
Certainly
learned?
not by chance. I mean, I think, it was interesting right before, maybe 2 weeks before everything shut down, which had been a year ago, right? Almost exactly. I got a call from some of my buddies at Wharton who were interested in doing a study with our training center students. And their theory was that if they could identify who was coming in to take classes who had a growth mindset versus those who had a fixed mindset, that the people with the growth mindset would succeed more fully in their training, and the people with the fixed mindset would have trouble. And I'm like, 1,000% that's going to be the case. We didn't get to run the study. We're hopefully going to, but just empirically over my 30 plus years at Second City, and my wife who ran the training center for 10 years, we're like, yeah, once I understood what the principles of growth and fixed were in terms of mindset, it's like, yep, that will identify the single factor that stands in the way of people who are problems in the workplace anyway. I mean, they, if they're having problems in the improv class, I'm guarantee you they're having problems at home and at the workplace. I mean, it's just the case. So I think, the various things we understand from our flirtations with behavioral science and neuroscience as well do bear out, and we see it bear out because we're putting people into play, having to do this work. It's almost like mini labs, constantly. But I'll say I know this for us at Second City because, I mean, we had to shut down all our live operations, and we have a big footprint on Wells Street in Chicago. But we're doing, in our corporate work, we're basically doing the same that we were doing live, just doing it virtual. And the very first workshop we turned virtual was for a major soft drink company. And it was my friend who used to run executive education at Yale. And she's like, I need something in resilience, and I need it to be like entertaining. And she's like, so I only thought of you guys.
Fantastic.
And so what we did, because she was very confused when I said we were going to have a musical director on the workshop. She's like, what do you mean? And I'm like, you'll see. And so when people got there was a pandemic playlist playing. And so people are entering to that. And then we had transition music. And it was just like, no, I mean, this is like, it's a television show. We needed to score it. And then I remember I was trying to work on the flow of exercises and what would translate and what wouldn't. And my wife was walking by me. I'm like, do you have anything for a resilience exercise? And she said, oh, yeah. This is something I just recently developed. And the exercise is called Wish. And what we did was we said, take a piece of paper and you're going to have 3 columns. And the first column, you're going to write down something you wish you could do now that you can't. So for me, that was like swim in the salt water. And the second column, you write down the emotion you think you'd have if you got to experience that wish. And so mine was feel refreshed. And the third column, well, write down something that you could do right now to experience that emotion. And I'm like, oh, put water on my face, exercise, go for a walk. And the revelation of our own agency to experience our emotion versus what our mind says about a wish, it's powerful when it becomes revealed. And this is the pedagogy. This is what improvisation is, a pedagogy. You learn by doing. So it's not just that I'm telling you this, it's that you're doing it yourself, and therefore having this sort of, embodied experience that is so much more powerful than just book learning.
Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah. Okay. You brought up a playlist. Kelly, what's on your playlist right now? What do you have a COVID playlist?
Well, okay, I have a COVID playlist, but now I've moved on. I am
done with COVID.
In addition to a lot of Keith Jarrett, because he just came out, he's never going to play again. He's ill in that way. So I listen to a lot of Keith Jarrett. Taylor Swift's Folklore and Evermore are brilliant albums, and I did not think I couldn't have named a Taylor Swift song 2 years ago. Was not on my radar. My daughter loved Taylor Swift, and and these COVID albums are brilliant work, both lyrically and sonically.
Yeah, she's a fine songwriter. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
And then the other is Lake Street Dive has a new album called Obviously, and they're so soulful and amazing. And it's funny. I think I'm rediscovering pop. I'm a big jazz and classical, and I've always enjoyed rock and roll. I listened to this podcast, Switched on Pop. I don't know if you guys have heard it.
Yep. Listen to it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's another fun way to re-enter the sort of contemporary pop vernacular that, as a younger man, I was fully immersed in, and you lose that connection when you're not on top of it.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
The other thing about music these days, and I don't know if this is just me being nostalgic or not, but I would sit there and play an album and then just study the album as it was being played.
Yeah.
Like you would sit there and you would read the liner notes, you would read the
Mhm.
lyrics, you would read who the producer was, all of those types of things. And today with playlists that are just on Spotify or Pandora, yeah, I might look at the all right, oh, this is a new song that just got popped into my playlist because of whatever. And I might actually even look to see who it is. But oftentimes it's just it's music that's going on for me. And I wonder how many people are actually, I know they are, and I know they're doing it different ways. And I'm just an old fogey who's just stuck in my oh, can't I have my album back with the pictures and everything else? But it's interesting to see how people are, getting into the music and getting into some of the nuances and details around that I wonder if albums, if they came back, if they would have that same kind of impact.
I heard something, and if it was on your podcast, please tell me that, but that Spotify searches, that more and more people are searching for sort of evocative images and words rather than a specific, give me soft jazz or whatever. And I know that's how I like to play around, because that's how I make discoveries. And early Pandora was great for that, because you're finding sort of sonic cousins of certain kinds of music that otherwise, I didn't know that I would love so many Canadian singer-songwriters until I started getting into Pandora, and I felt a little embarrassed about it, but there it is.
That's fantastic. All we want to do right now is say thank you very much, Kelly. Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time and your talent, and good luck with your projects with the Booth School.
Thanks so much. It was great talking to you guys. Now we switch. Kurt and Tim, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
I want to, so you guys host this terrific podcast that I listen to, and in our previous conversation, we were talking about COVID, and that is on everyone's mind. And I read a Medium article, Kurt, I think that you wrote, and you write in it, quote, "People do not handle living with uncertainty very well. As humans, we have a tendency towards negativity bias, viewing things as more negative than positive." Do you have a set of solutions for getting us out of that? Because that sounds dreadful.
Oh man, you take improv classes. That's what you do in order to. So it's a natural tendency that we have as humans. It's this, we've evolved because, hey, we were the survivors. We were the ones who had that negativity bias that said that snap in the woods isn't our good friend, so I don't have to worry about it. It might be the saber-toothed tiger, so therefore I should be concerned. That being said, today we live in a world where there are a lot of uncertainties. Most of them are not going to cause imminent death. And so we have an element of our brain, the neurocortex, the frontal lobe of our brain, that we can think and overcome that if we train it to. That being said, it's not easy. It's not something that you flip a switch and all of a sudden you do it. But there are, mindfulness exercises allow us to pause. Elements of it. I was kind of joking when I said improv, but not really, because it is that yes and element that gets you to think about things, about possibilities, as opposed to roadblocks. We talked about obstacles before. Those are things that if we can shift how we think about those, then that allows us for a much better opportunity to overcome that negativity bias and to live in this world of, hey, it's a little bit uncertain. I'm okay with that.
Yeah. In that piece, you also talk about talking to the emotion. And Tim, this is something that shows up in other things that I've seen, that you've written. But talk to us about what that means. What are we thinking about when we're saying talk to the emotion?
Well, our emotions aren't, in the classical economic sense, rational, right? Right. So we have to start with, we're not going to able to appeal to our emotions with just facts and figures. We're not going to just start out with, well, no, emotions, 86% 99% of the time, we don't do this. So just don't do that. So we kind of have to go with the sense of, if I'm feeling a sense of risk, how am I going to deal with that feeling? And as opposed to, there's a 26% risk chance of me going out into the backyard and being bit by a copperhead snake.
Yeah.
Well, how am I going to feel about doing something different? And so talking to my emotions, or starting with a conversation with my emotions, often begins with, you know what? There are other things going on in the world. There's something else. There's something bigger. People have survived this. What are the sort of asking, without using base rates, for instance, but what's sort of the base rate of survival in this, of people asking, going in and asking for a raise? How many people actually got fired on the spot? Well, actually, I don't know of anyone. So maybe I actually don't have to worry about getting fired on the spot if I ask for a raise, things like that, and kind of talking myself through the emotional side of it.
Well,
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm going to just
Please.
add on to that for a little bit. I'm not a counselor. My PhD is definitely not in counseling or clinical psychology. But I know that some of the courses I took, and forgive me, I don't know the research behind it, but just even naming your fears helps you be able to overcome those fears. And so talking to that emotion is naming that emotion. I work with my kids all the time, not all the time. When my kids are talking about me or talking to me, which is rare, and they're talking to me about something that is scary or emotional, I ask them to say, all right, let's try to get, don't just try to ignore it. You need to face it. You need to figure out what it is, and then you're better able to overcome it. So
so I'm sure this happens to you, but I'll have on a variety of guests from different fields. And something that comes up a lot is writing it down. And this is a really interesting thing, because it seems so stupidly simple, but it's not. I just interviewed Devin Price, who has a book called Laziness Does Not Exist, which I found fascinating. And they have this practice in their therapy of every night sort of writing down the things that were troubling and then throwing it away.
Yeah.
It was like over a matter of weeks, just transform themselves. And, and then there's morning pages. There's all these different places that comes from that I just, like, wow. So I've actually tried to incorporate that into my world. And guess what? It works.
And by the way, the Devin Price episode was great. I listened to it. In preparation for this, the idea of writing things down, again, is that facing of your fear. It's that being able to name it and say, all right, here we are. This is it. And I love the idea of taking that and throwing it away. There's that symbolic piece that goes along with that. Mm-hmm. And our brains, our conscious brain realizes this is symbolic, but other parts in our deeper recesses of our brain don't necessarily have that cognitive function. And so they're going, it's gone. It is now thrown away. The neuro way that transmitters and the various pathways that we have within our brain all of a sudden are going, oh, I don't have to worry about that anymore because it is no longer an issue. So
there's also something wonderful about writing that connects to our unconscious that doesn't happen when we're thinking. Thinking tends to be a much more conscious experience. Writing is both the conscious, but it also connects to our unconscious in a way that allows us to, as we're writing, and just, I want to emphasize this, Kelly, when you're talking about writing, you're talking about picking up a pen or a pencil and a piece of paper. This is not sitting down at a keyboard. Very, very different experience. But when you've got that pencil and piece of paper in your hand, then you're actually allowing that unconscious to feed through as you're writing. And I think that it's absolutely magical. So, Kelly, you've written a lot of comedy, you've produced a lot of things where you had to write things down.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a songwriter. Sometimes just the act of songwriting is literally just allowing my hand just to write, just to actually be present in the moment, because I'm not exactly 100% sure what's going to come out in the word after the word that I'm writing. And that's magic.
Yeah, when I co-wrote my book, that changed everything in terms of my relationship to the art form. It's not that I didn't have the thoughts, and it's not that, but suddenly I aligned my thoughts with my actions in a way that I hadn't. And I do think it's also tied to something I talk a lot about, which is practice. And you had a piece that you wrote about Don Durrett, a virtuoso jazz guitarist who decided he wanted to take up bass. Which I thought was fascinating. So talk to us about what's cool about that, and what did it do?
He had to start from the beginning, just like everybody else. Right. He just had to, he had to have a beginner's mindset. He had to go back and say, okay, I'm going to learn bass because I think it's a fantastic instrument. But just because I'm a virtuoso jazz guitarist doesn't mean I'm going to start at the top. This is not Anchorman, drop me off the top. This is actually start at the beginning, learn the basics, get your hands in the right places. And over time, he certainly, was able to use his expertise on the guitar to help him. But he still had to start at the very bottom and work his way up. And he became a very good jazz bassist over the course of, it took several years, 6 or 7 years of concentrated effort. But it was really cool to see and to watch him be a part of that experience too.
So this is interesting because I and earlier in the episode when you were interviewing me, I told you about Heather Caruso and how we started Second Science Project. And after we became friends and we started knowing about each other's personal lives and why we're sitting at the table we're sitting at, I had told her how I sort of blew up my life and had to figure out this bridge in or bridge out. And she said that there is evidence that people who have a certain kind of expertise, if they stay in that same role, are less happy over time as they get older. However, if they find adjacent ways to apply their expertise, they are much happier. And because we're all music nerds, it's like, oh, this explains Neil Young. This explains David Bowie. This explains Lou Reed. All these masters who continued, and the only reason they did that is because they took these broad chances that didn't always pay off. Like that rockabilly period for Neil Young was not fun for anyone.
But it helped him grow. David Byrne's Broadway show.
David Byrne. Oh my God, that show is genius.
Totally. And and if it wasn't for that incredible curiosity that he had to go from, playing at CBGB's, basically a cement basement, I mean, he just continued to have curiosity about things. And my sincerest hope is to someday get to interview David about his perception of the way music and behavior go together. But now I'm editorializing.
So Kurt, I mean, like you guys hosted the podcast, you have your businesses, but I can't imagine that. I imagine that it was that pivot where you're suddenly having to explore all these people's different works that kind of awoke something new in you at a certain point when maybe you thought, I know my stuff, I'm good.
Yeah, it is. Well, it definitely awoke a lot of different things in me. Just having to deal with Tim every week, those are different awakenings that we
separate interview.
Yeah, so we won't go there. There is an aspect. So I've had my own company for 23, 24 years, and we have pivoted. So the conversation that you're just talking about, this idea that it's that adjacent and yet still there, I think is really interesting. I started off, the vast majority of the work I did for the first 5 years of my business, and even a couple of years before that, was team building. We were doing team building programs where, you're talking earlier about some of the exercises that you guys used in your improv. Those are the types of things that we would do to get teams to work better together and make those breakthroughs and all of that kind of fun stuff. And then I was getting bored. And so we branched off and we started doing some other pieces, but they were tangential. And then when I found one of the theories that I use a ton in the work, even to today, is called the 4 drive model. And it's this drive is developed by Nitin Noria and Paul Lawrence, both from Harvard. Paul has passed away now, but they were talking about the motivations that drive us at work. And they came up with 4: the drive to acquire, drive to bond, drive to be challenged or create, and then this drive to defend. And I can go off on that. I won't. But what was really interesting for me is being part of this team building piece. It was one of those aspects where all of a sudden I'm realizing, damn it, this is it, because it wasn't just motivation from all the things that you can acquire.
Yeah.
But it was about bonding, which ties right into team building, right? It's like we build these bonds and then it's about challenge. And so, yeah, again, team building is like we put people in these experiential things and they have challenges they have to overcome, which helps with the bonding. And then this defend, and you get these teams together, and it's that, red team, blue team. And all of a sudden, they're competing and they're defending their team against the other teams. And so all of a sudden it made all this natural sense to me. And I'm going, yes, this is the next iteration. So I didn't answer your question there, but you know what? It was a fun little journey down my past.
Well, I want to add to the yes and side of what you've written about so eloquently, Kelly, is Kurt has been in his business for 20 plus years. As I'm leaving corporate life, I picked out a handful of consultants and people who have had successful businesses to say, what would it be like if I do this? Because I was planning on getting into behavioral science consulting. Mm-hmm. And so while Kurt and I were having lunch to talk about my next move, there was a yes and moment when Kurt just said, we should start something. And I said, that's a great idea. What should we do? And that led to the idea of a meetup. About expanding the community around behavioral science. And just before the second meetup, we said, gosh, we're going to have this fantastic speaker at this meetup. There's only 25 people signed up and 250 people should be listening to him. And Kurt just said, well, what can we do about that? And I said, I don't know. We've promoted it as much as we can. And then Kurt pulled a yes and said, how about if we just make it a podcast? And without knowing anything about podcasting, I said, that's a great idea. And that we figured it out.
Yeah.
I go, Tim, you're a musician. You have all this equipment. It can't be that hard, right? Little did we know.
Yeah. I have a very similar origin story. What I didn't tell you guys about the sort of story about Second Science Project that started, the actual beginning part was that I was on vacation. I stepped down from my position. I was on vacation and my second city caught on fire. And I get a call in Michigan saying, hey, your office is on fire. And it's on WLS channel 7 or on the web. And I look, and indeed, flames are shooting out of the office I just moved into like 6 weeks ago.
Oh, my God.
So the firefighters saved the stages, but all the stuff around them was, ruined largely, including my set of offices, which were next to the corporate division, who I wasn't, even though I'd written the book, I wasn't really working with them. So we all got cramped into temporary offices downtown together. And then we moved to the Trib Tower where WGN Radio is. And I was walking with my boss, Steve Johnston, ran into the program director at GN, who my dad worked there forever. And he's like, hey, come up for coffee. And I remember Steve tells the story to this day that he was like, we're going to walk out of here and you're going to either have a radio show or a podcast. And I walked out of there and they're like, let's start a podcast.
Oh, yeah. I love it.
Didn't know.
Love it. Serendipity.
Yeah. I mean, and great symbolism in terms of, and I remember saying this to my owner at the time. I said, there's something about a fire, right? And it really provided an opportunity for some of us to, just start over, build new stuff. It's that, not wasting the crisis that you're in.
Yeah. Well, in a fire in Chicago, there you go.
Yeah, even more so. Even more so. Okay. Meetings suck. Meetings are terrible. You guys have talked about this in the podcast and you've written about it. Let's just get practical. How do we make meetings better for all of humanity? So the first thing I'm going to offer is they should all be much shorter. What do you think?
Much shorter. Make sure that the people that are in the meeting need to be there. I have been in way too many meetings where we have 6-7 people in there when we really need 2 or 3. And the other 3 are sitting around twiddling their thumbs and wasting their time and going, what the hell is going on? And then they feel like they have to contribute. So then it just adds to the length of everything that's going on there. The other thing is, from my perspective, is pay attention to the personalities that are in that meeting. There is the big overview of this, and you see it all the time. Like, have your agenda, have your different, these different things, stand up when you're doing a meeting, whatever those other roles are. And I'm sure some of them work really well. But part of this is really being a human and just looking and saying, who's in here? What are they like? What do they want? How do we work best together? And if that person is a driving personality, then get right to the point. If that person is more of a emotive, caring, like ask them about, how's their family doing? How are you doing in these times? Those are key pieces. And granted, hard when you have a big group of people and it's a big meeting, can't do that with everybody, but at least pay attention to that.
Yep. Yes. And be social. Start the meetings with being social. We are social creatures. If you start the meeting right on the nose of the point that has to be agreed upon or move forward in the meeting, you lose the opportunity to actually understand who else is in the room, to get to what Kurt's talking about, and not just understanding, but actually just allowing people to breathe as human beings. And we need that now, need with a capital N. It's really, really important right now for us to just be human beings with each other.
I think too, in COVID times, especially thinking back to Jane Dutton at University of Michigan talks about this idea of we don't do well with suffering at work.
Mm.
And suffering is an essential part of the human condition, and we need to. And the idea at the beginning of the meeting for everyone to talk about something that maybe is hurts, whether it's a toe or whether that also, and is similar to our writing it down, takes that out of the equation for the individual, but for the group, it allows them to also focus in on, oh, this is a particular pain point this person has. I need to be conscious and helpful to that.
Yeah. Liz Fosslien, who we interviewed, wrote a great book, Emotions at Work. Was that it, Tim? I can't remember if that Emotions at Work. And that exact piece, right? We've always frowned upon emotions at work. We've always seen it as being vulnerable and weak and various different pieces. And she's like saying, no, this is not the case. We need to be emotive at work because that's part of our humanness of this. And one of the things that she talked about when we interviewed her around COVID is that, hey, we are missing within COVID on these Zoom meetings and everything else is we're missing those bump in moments that we get to have some of those social interactions and be more of a human with that person before and after those meetings in the lunchroom, in the hallway, that we just don't have. And so we have to be much more purposeful about that today and really focus in on having that human aspect of those meetings be there, as Tim said. Start with the social, make sure that that's real.
The reality also comes in authenticity. I think about Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality, like bring your whole self to work. Don't just, and then of course, Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety. You've got to have a solid foundation of being able and having a group of people who are accepting of this is how I'm feeling. Because without the psychological safety, having any kind of social time is just blah, blah, blah.
When I had Amy on the podcast before we started, I'm like, I am a giant fan. And she's like, what is wrong with you? And like, she couldn't understand the level of nerd appreciation I had for this woman and her work. The other thing I'll add to this, and this came really true when I read Adam Alter's book, Irresistible, is the technology that stands between us. I mean, the idea that a phone, even upside down on a conference room, takes attention away between parties. So I was running an innovation meeting before a while ago. And my rule was, if you're going to be in this meeting, computers off the table, phones in pockets, no technology in front of us. And the dynamic was dramatically different.
Wow. I'm old enough to remember when we had meetings before we had cell phones and laptop computers. And I remember distinctly the first meeting that I went into is a series of, we were down actually in Augusta, had all these executives from various different companies around. We had designed the meeting so that it was no longer than, I think, 60 minutes before they got a 30-minute break. So an hour and then 30 or 20 minutes off so that they could go and get on their phone and talk. And people, it was when BlackBerrys first came out, and they're sitting there and they're talking about these great devices and they're just not paying attention and trying to do all this other things. And one gentleman said this thing, he said, I love this because I can be out on my sailboat on Chesapeake Bay and I can be working. And I just thought, to the life of me, what the hell are you thinking? That's not what this should, anyway, it was very, and now we live in a life where that's what happens. But man, that was scary.
This is an interesting thing about this time period, because when we do a weekly meeting that we just started, a couple months ago or 3 months ago, that a colleague and I were just like, let's just do 20 minutes every Friday with the people who are left working at Second City. It's a much smaller group, and we'll celebrate our wins for the week, and we'll always interview someone. And our last question with them is, like, what have you enjoyed about COVID times? And almost every single one is like getting to spend time with my children, or getting to reconnect with my wife, or what have you. But it's this idea that, in the old world before the Industrial Revolution, like, we worked from home and we got out of that rhythm, and it was not all for good.
I am such a big fan of that concept, Kelly. I think that the Industrial Revolution really screwed us. That the idea in the 1840s and 50s, getting everybody out of the home and having to go to a space to work was really actually kind of a counterproductive thing in terms of our work-life balance, because that forced us into having to make a choice between work and life. So, work and home. So now I don't feel like we're sort of rediscovering that part of our DNA in a not so comfortable way, because we got all of this access through these devices that are coming after us constantly. Whereas in the past, if I grew up on a farm in the 1830s, well, we milk the cows today. We don't have to milk them again. We're done. Have we harvested the wheat? Yep. Or we're not all done. So we'll finish it tomorrow. And you could kind of shut down from there. Kurt and I were having this conversation this morning. So
we were having
this topical for me.
Very, very similar conversation. And I think the interesting piece, and we talked about this with some of our guests at the beginning of COVID, is everybody's like, what's going to stick? We've changed all these behaviors. We're all working from home. What's going to stick? What's not going to stick? And I was of the nature that, hey, we are very status quo people, and we're going to, as soon as this is going to be, A, we thought it was going to be over in 2 weeks. B, then it was maybe a couple months, but now it's lasted for a year, right? But this idea that we would just go back to our old habits and routines, I don't think that's going to happen. I think that we have actually hit a part within society, within work. And part of it is just people, employees saying, hey, look, I'm productive at home. I like this. This is great. Yes, let's go into work one day a week or whatever it is. But I also think that it's businesses going, how much are we paying for rent?
Right. Sure.
How much do I have to pay for those desks and computers at home, versus, downtown
and you can
office?
measure the productivity in many of these jobs very easily. This is like my son picked up a job as a tech recruiter, and it's like he knows how many people he got jobs. I mean, it's and he's at top of his list, and he's working from home. It's interesting. So this topic came up in consecutive podcast tapings. Shelley Archambault, who is the first Black female tech CEO, talked about eliminating the words work-life balance. She talked about work-life integration. Mm-hmm. I liked that, but it was topped by Joanne Lublin, who quotes an anthropologist, I'm forgetting her name, who talked about work-life sway. And I am obsessed by this now. I feel like this concept of sway implies a much bigger thing, because sway can be seen as this sort of sashaying positive, but can also be where the wind is blowing you at any given time. And so that concept of like, I don't know, there's some physical, muscular sense to that fits better with, the hellfire that is the times we live in, I think.
Yeah. Well, and Tim and I had this conversation about the work-life balance, just the terminology. And I'm like going, I don't like that, because it is this like weighing of, all right, it's work and then it's life. And I'm going, no, it's all life. It is all life. Work is part of it. Play is part of it. Family is part of it. Yep. We need to, and I love the sway concept. I think that's great.
Yeah.
Okay. For each of you, who's the guest that you want that you haven't gotten yet?
Should I go first? So we just had first. one of my ones.
You were such a fanboy. I had a joke that I didn't get to use yet, which is I'm less sexy than Dessa and more sexy than Max Bazerman. So if you're trying to rate that for your podcast,
you're closer to Dessa though. Kelly, you're closer to Dessa. Yeah.
The Bazerman factor, the Bazerman Dessa factor, that should be our new. Yeah.
So Dessa was obviously one of them. Love her, and you can. It came across that I was a fanboy. But my one that I have had since almost really very early on within the podcast was Alan Alda.
Oh,
and I would love to get Alan Alda on the show. And part of it is just because as I'm thinking in my head, my mom has passed away many years, but she, if I was telling her what we do and the guests that we have, she wouldn't get excited about any of them. She would get super excited about Alan Alda. And I think that would just be cool. So
quick follow-up to that before I ask Tim. So was it Christmas? Yes. During Christmas, the folks at WGN had discovered a bunch of old recordings of my dad doing interviews. And the one of them that they chose to play was him interviewing Alan Alda like in 1972, mostly about sort of equal rights. And then he explains what Szechuan food is to my dad. And it's like it is a far more innocent time.
Oh my God. Well, he's doing some great Yeah, he's doing great work on communication and particularly science communication, and I think which is a really important thing. So it's not just this another fanboy thing. It really is. There is a connection between
I
this.
had him on the podcast, and actually Val Lance Gaffro, who used to be the head of his training, who now is the artistic director using improv for medicine for a medical school.
Awesome,
cool as hell. All right, Tim, who do you want?
Well, we've already mentioned his name, David Byrne. I mean, it would be really cool to talk to the Nobel laureates, Thaler and Kahneman. That would be, terrific. There's a list of great researchers, Barry Schwartz, people that we would love to have as guests. But I think the real difficult, the unobtainable for me would be David Byrne, because I just think he is a remarkably bright guy who thinks about things in not just a different way, but in a really meaningful way. Would love to talk to him.
Yeah. Do you get a lot of no's, or are you pretty good?
With a small number. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we get more yeses than I would have ever anticipated.
Yeah.
I think too, there's a certain point. I don't know, how many years have you guys been on?
3. A little over 3.
I'm a little longer than you. There's that point when the publicists realize that you actually do the research and read the book, and they're like, okay. I'm
trying to point at these books behind me because we get all these books that we get sent, which is, hey, it's a nice little perk,
No,
so
it's great. And you build up this relationship, and it's funny. I had one of my dream gets is actually the author Robert McFarlane. And I don't know how much you guys know about my backstory, but my wife and I lost our daughter Nora to cancer a couple of years ago when she had just turned 17. And part of the journey, both the cancer journey, but then the grief journey, were, frankly, like music and poetry and nature and all the things that we have read about, but we really needed, to survive. And McFarlane wrote this beautiful book called The Lost Words that had been given to us. Do you know the story about this book?
Oh.
So apparently a few years back, a kid's dictionary in Britain came out with their new edition. They had added a bunch of words like cell phone and email, but they had taken out something like 30 words like bramble and heron. And McFarlane enlisted a artist and wrote a bunch of poems to bring the words back, these lost words, back where they belonged. And they were all words of nature. And I was really moved by this book and read the poetry a lot. And we got this call from Nora's school, and this is maybe 6 months after she passed. And they said, "Can you come over?" And we knew that they were building a new outdoor space and they were going to invest in this. And we walk up into this room and there's all these renderings, and that book is on the desk. And this is the magic of it. And they're like, "We want to name the park after Nora." And we've been using this book as inspiration. I'm like, I've been using this book. And so that's sort of in process right now. And it was just this sort of, wow.
That's an amazing story. So, hey, I'm welling up here, but there's that serendipity that we talked about earlier that sometimes I think if we're open to it, and this is not the scientist in me, right? This is definitely not the scientist in me, that I just go that the world presents these things, and sometimes you just have to grab hold of them and take them and just appreciate them for what they are. And that's a great story.
Though. We were Tina Seelig at Stanford, and Ann and I, my wife Ann and I, were there on campus. We were doing a talk for Jennifer Ocker, who's in the marketing department. But Tina, who had been on the podcast, wanted to have coffee. And so we're talking, and she was doing research on luck. Mm-hmm. And Anne offhandedly said, "Oh, Kelly's incredibly lucky. He gets a parking space. Like no one gets parking spaces like he does." And Tina said, "It's not that Kelly is lucky about it. It's that he assumes he's going to get a parking space. So he sees the space that's there." And she goes, and I was like, "Oh, I get that." So that I remain myself open to the fact that there probably is a spot for me. So I'm going to see it where someone else is like, "There's not going to be a spot," and you're going to miss it.
Yeah.
The kicker on this is McFarlane. I asked to have him on the podcast. The publicist, who was a friend, because I booked a number of people, said, "Oh, he's done doing interviews right now." And I said, "Will you pass along the story?" And he just emailed me back a lovely note about wanting to he'll come on the podcast in the fall and wants to stay involved with the project. So,
yeah, that's fantastic.
Wow.
And again, it's that the being open to it and being able to tell that story. I mean, hopefully Alan Alda will hear my story about my mom and knowing like, hey, you're the only person that she would recognize. And maybe that might have some impact.
Anything's going to come out of this experience. We're getting all I don't know about David Byrne. I don't have that contact.
Well, what the hell? And when you started talking about the parking space, I thought that you were going with the old the joke about the Irish drunk who's on his way to the liquor store and he's driving and he needs to pull up on the side of the road to park to get into the liquor store and can't find a parking space. He says, "Oh, dear Lord, please, I'll do anything. I'll be at mass every weekend if you can just find me a park." Oh, actually, don't worry, I got one.
I love it. All right. So the way we end this podcast is we ask each of our guests for a yes and story. And so we've talked about the principle of yes and. Who wants to go first with their yes and story?
Can I? Because then it's easier. Because I think Tim and I might do the same one.
Go for it.
We started talking about it on this. It's the yes and of this show that we do, the behavioral group show that we do, which really was this conversation between Tim and I and saying, what can we do? And then it was, well, what do we do? A meetup? Yes. And why don't we bring these guests? Yes. And why don't we, do this on this piece? And it really was this culmination of a number of yes ands together that formulated this. And to this day, and we didn't say that you were talking earlier about just, the podcast and things in alignment or next to and changing. And this really has been, for the past 3 years, the highlight of my week when we get to work on this. Wait, yes, I have my regular job and it's tangential to this, but this is the fun stuff. This is the stuff that just gets me going and really is. And so it's been fantastic. So,
I love it. And I think it's palpable in the product.
Yeah.
I think.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
Tim, how about you?
What's the framing that you're looking for, Kelly? I just want to, since Kurt took one of the best ones there.
Yeah, it's basically the idea that we talked about, which is people's default setting, and we do it all the time, is to do nothing or say no. And often our regrets are about the things that we didn't do. So where's that point in your life or your work where you didn't stop at yes, you actually said yes, and I'm gonna go do this thing, and a thing happened.
I'm thinking about the podcast and thinking about some relationships that Kurt and I had at Carnegie Mellon University. Oh. And when we were talking about interviewing a couple of these professors, one of them I knew would not go on the podcast.
Yeah.
I just knew that he wouldn't. But he's not the head of the department, but is a very senior guy. And I said, but maybe we could just, do something crazy. Like, let's just go. Let's go to Carnegie Mellon and set up a whole bunch of interviews. And Kurt's like, well, of course, we're just going to get on a plane and buy a ticket and go to Carnegie Mellon, because let's see, how much money have we made from this? Zero. So of course, let's spend more of our own money and fly out to Pittsburgh. And then Linda Babcock, the head of the department, while we were there, she said, so, did you ask this guy to be on the podcast? And I was like, no. Because I know him and I know that he would say no. She's like, well, I know that he'd say no, but I'll make sure he gets there. And we got the interview with George Lowenstein because we were there, and Linda Babcock, the head of the department, just dragged him into the room for 30 minutes and said, you have to sit down and do this. I was sweating bullets knowing how uncomfortable it was for George the entire time. And Kurt's like, I don't have that worry. And Kurt was fantastic. Kurt was absolutely the star.
No, Tim was fantastic. It was a great one, but it was a yes and. The whole thing of we just said, what about let's do a group with a research institution and try to get a bunch of people together. Yeah, that sounds great, and we can go and fly there and be there, and then so it was all of these series of yes ands, and to that point, we had asked George in preparation for this, and he had said no. And so we said, okay, fine. We respect that.
Totally.
And we will do that. And then, when your boss says you need to go and do it, I guess there's a little bit more pressure on that. So,
and we did get to do one of the interviews in a room where they were testing birth control tools requiring a vaginal insert. And so we got to do one of the interviews in that room. And let me just say, that was vivid. That was memorable.
This is striking me as a business opportunity to get a university to pay for this as a way to promote their services, where you just go and interview like everyone at Wharton.
That would be a good idea.
That would be cool.
People go where the money is.
We need to find some of that money, because that's definitely not what we're doing now. So
all right, the podcast is called Behavioral Grooves. Everyone should check it out. Kurt and Tim, thank you for coming on the show.
Kelly, thank you. This has been fun. We laughed, and hopefully
We laughed, we cried.
we cried.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our discussion with Kelly, have a free-flowing conversation, and we talk about whatever else comes into our yes and thank you because brains.
Okay, that's good. I like that. I'm glad you went beyond just yes and. So yes.
Yes, and I'm glad you recognize that I went beyond yes and. You could go a little far, like we did in the intro. We might have pushed that a little too far. What do you think?
I think we did. But that was perfect as far as I was concerned. Just being a little, if one joke is good, 2 jokes are better, and 3
and 100 jokes are just hilarious, right?
Well, yeah. Why not try it? So, what did you think? Was this fun? Did you like it?
This was fun. This was a cool format. We'll talk about this, I'm sure. But the idea of turning the tables and then being interviewed, that was a little weird. But hey, Kelly is a super knowledgeable and fun person, and my God, the work that he's doing is just amazing. And his history, holy shit, to be able to talk about 30 years plus at Second City and all the people that he's worked with and all of the cool work that he's done, that's pretty amazing.
So let's talk about this idea of why it was weird. Why was it weird to go from being the interviewer to being interviewed?
Yeah, weird is probably the wrong term. It felt different. There was a distinct change when we switched from being the interviewers to being the interviewees. And in the interviewer format, I don't know, this is different with you, but I'm always trying to think about not necessarily what that next question is, but trying to listen to the conversation to pull nuggets out that are interesting to me that then I can maybe expand upon, and trying to understand where this conversation is going, versus when I'm the interviewee, right? It's the element of having to go in and dig into your own personal experience and try to pull something out from that relates to the question that was asked. And I don't know, it's different.
It's a mindset change, isn't it? I mean, at some level, it is a very different experience, and yet it's still asking questions, answering questions. And yet we put a different kind of value on the answering of questions than we put on the asking of questions, or they mean something different to us. When I talk about us, I'm not necessarily talking about humans in general. I'm talking about you and me. because
we're just talking about us. Well, who cares about the rest of the freaking world?
It's a small, right? I think that it's fairly universal, but I'm not sure.
There's even a difference between what we do here in the grooving session, right? Where it's a give and take and it's back and forth. And there's, yes, you ask me questions, I ask you questions, but it's more feels like a conversation as opposed to being interviewed, where we're supposed to be the experts and expound upon the universe and all that happens and our great wisdom and knowledge. And it's kind of intimidating.
I like how you turned into your voice changed there.
Oh, yes.
Getting very big and bold and voice of God kind of thing.
Well, and for people that can't see, my hands started going up and I was very gesturing and big. Yes, this is how it goes. This is how the world works, and you shall listen to my words and bow before my great intellect.
Yes, and back to what we're talking about here. That switch is fascinating.
It is,
especially when it's like a corn sweet effect. Like when we have things that really aren't very different. When you separate them from each other, it's like they just appear to be the same. But when you put them right up next to each other, they look very different.
Yeah. I mean, both of us have been interviewed for other podcasts multiple times.
Yeah.
It didn't seem as strange then. I think you're going in with that mindset that you are going to be interviewed. Mm-hmm. So you don't have that comparison that right next to each other. That's a really good point there. The other piece that was interesting about that, though, I find this interesting and nobody else does, but is that the first time we've talked about our origin story on the podcast? I know we've talked about it in other places, but have we talked about how we got started with this crazy thing way back in 2017?
I don't know, but it might just be boring as hell for people, or it might have some value and more passing interest, or it could be, wow. I don't know. I don't know how people respond to that.
I don't know if anybody was going, wow, but they might have had a passing interest, or they just fast forwarded through that part. So, all right. So the main concept of our conversation, switching back to when we were interviewing Kelly,
yeah,
I think the main piece that I got from this was this idea that improv is a way of thinking about how you approach the world and how you approach life. And that if you lean into this yes and, that you can drastically improve your life. That there are this idea of being flexible in the way that you're responding to others' requests is a key piece of a good life. And I take it back and I think about our conversation with John Levy, who's talking about leading with gratitude, or this benevolence element, right? Or generosity, not gratitude, leading with generosity. And there's something about having some generosity with yes and, I think.
There is. I would absolutely agree. I to pull a yes and on that. Yes. And it reminds me of conversations that you and I have had with John Sweeney we've known John for many years, who leads the Brave New Workshop here in Minneapolis. And John really convinced me that yes and is a great corporate way of life. It's a great way of leading your teams. It's a great way of leading business development projects. It's a great way of leading product development projects. That yes and is an extraordinarily powerful tool in the corporate world, not just as a way of getting things done, but kind of as a way of building some psychological safety. On some level, it's actually a way of working with the people on your teams in a way that's really respectful. And that leads to more productive teams.
And I think it's vastly different than saying no or yes, but. Those shut that conversation down. They shut down that psychological safety. Even when you're doing a yes and, but putting limitations on things. So in reality, there's a little bit of a yes, but in there. The way that you set it up and frame it in that manner, the yes and again, I don't think you always have to use yes and those actual words. It's the concept of making that agreement and then going beyond that agreement to expand the concept behind it, or reframe that concept and take it to a new level, a new place. That, I think, is the key aspect. And what you're talking about from a business perspective, I think, is absolutely 100% true. And we have a number of listeners and people who come to the meetups that are creative types, that are ideation people. And I bet they would probably agree. We'll have to ask them. But that, I think, is just absolutely 100% on target, Mr. Houlihan.
I agree that we don't have to use the words yes and. We can just get to the feeling of it. At the same time, there's a wonderful benefit of actually teeing up an idea by saying yes and. And because you're telegraphing to everybody in the room who are on the Zoom call who is listening, who is familiar with the term, that they're going to, now I'm going to say something that's additive, that brings more ideas to the table. And it's not a bad idea. And my personal experience in one of the teams that I led in my last job, everybody was big on yes and. We all got into the habit of it. It became a social norm for our group. And yeah, there were times when someone was saying yes, and it was a little bit sarcastic because in some ways they wanted to disagree, but it's still a powerful tool to say, I have something that I want to add to this. I'm not going to try and reduce you. I'm going to try to build you up a little bit.
I like that concept, the build you up piece. Going back to some piece from that Kelly did that's beyond, he didn't talk about this, but this is some other work that he's done. He talks about yes as this idea of feel grateful for what I have because criticizing it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And the and is this idea of what's next and exploring what's next even before we know it. If you think about improv, you're thinking on your feet. You're in the moment. It's this idea that's all right. Yes, let's go with that. And I don't know what's coming next, but it will come if I just extend that and long enough, it'll be there.
Give your unconscious a break. Just let your unconscious do its work because it's doing all the work all the time. Why not just let it do some work? Give it a chance.
Yes, and this idea that you can silence that inner critic, because we all have that inner critic in our brains that says, "Oh, we can't do this. This is too hard. This is too crazy." And when you say yes, and that critic just has to shut up because you're not saying yes, but. The but is the critic coming in. So
in that idea comes a couple of things for me. One is intentionality. Which is a theme that you and I come back to all the time. Gratitude, which is a huge thing that's baked into yes and there is a sense of gratitude, especially when we get to thanks because that's very gratitude oriented. But there's a flexibility that's built into this as well. And I don't want to miss the opportunity just to mention our conversation with Katie Milkman and talking about the flexible Fernando idea in her book, How to Change, how we are living in a dynamic world and a little bit of flexibility can go a long way.
Yes. So. Yes. Yes. And.
Yes.
And. Okay. So how do we apply this to our work life? What is a way that we can take this concept and apply it into our work life? You've already talked about that we need to be intentional, and that this idea that you have used this with your team in the past with great success in building a culture of yes and. But when people come and make a request to you that is just outlandish, are you supposed to say yes and? It's like, oh, I need this data by tonight. Can you do it? It's 1 p.m. I got everything else going on. This is going to be a 3-hour project. Should I say yes? And
well, that's a great question, because in many of those team meetings, these opportunities or these environments are stretch environments. They're about stretching us, not about trying to form boundaries, because I think we should differentiate between what is a stretch request or an unreasonable request, right? Adam Grant talked about having boundaries.
Yeah.
And this is where yes and needs to be applied in a way where you're really saying, I do have boundaries. I can do so many things, but I'm not superhuman.
Yeah. And in Give and Take, he talks about this idea that givers, are more successful, but they're also over time, but they're also at the bottom over time. And the difference is those givers that set boundaries are the ones that are successful, and the ones that don't are the ones that end up being just run over by people because they're too accommodating and they're too giving. The idea, though, that you talk about, this idea that there are moments to stretch. And I think that is a key piece here. This isn't necessarily about some of the everyday routine pieces, although I think it works in really nice there. But it's in this,
in the
strategizing area. It's in this planning, this visioning, this what is the possibility, instead of saying, no, that's a dumb idea. It's a brainstorming element, right? To a certain degree, it is this
very much so.
Expansive. So if we think of an improv comedy troupe going up on stage, it gets shut down as soon as somebody says, oh, and you're wearing a red hat. No, I'm not. Well, okay, that just shuts this down. It's like, yes, and that red hat actually changes colors, and now it's green, so this is the concept that if you're in those types of sessions with your teams, those broad ones, it's like, let's expand, let's go yes and bring that to it. So how do we apply this to our personal lives?
I think that that's a great question, because it comes up, for me, the yes and thing comes up in discussions with some family members who are conspiracy theorists.
Yes, and tell me more about this, Tim.
I have to get over my own, as Adam Hansen would say, my own negativity bias, right? and come at the question, or come at the topic of I forget it. What when they put the stuff in the jet fuel, and you see the
chemtrails,
chemtrails. It's chemtrails. That's it. So when you see the chemtrails, that my family members are talking about how they're controlling us. I'm like what the, I want to challenge them. What the hell are they controlling, and how do they do it? But yes, and could be used in a more subtle way to emphasize just, okay, so I'm being curious. So tell me about that. Yes, this is controlling us. Tell me about the kinds of things that they're controlling.
How does that work? And how are they doing this? Yes,
like Kwame Christian.
Yeah, there we go. We were both going there, right? This idea of this compassionate curiosity moving forward. I think yes and is an absolute wonderful way of being compassionate and curious at the same time. It's yes and tell me how, so your compassion is the yes and your curiosity is the and. I love that. I also think, going back to what we said about work and those moments when it's the strategizing, visioning piece, and with your family, it's that time when, your kid asks you to do something and you're busy and is just like, oh, do I really want to do this? Approach it with yes, and let's do that at this point when we can do it together and I can put my full focus on this. But yes, not just yes, I'd like to do that, but I can't. Let's reframe things and look at things from a different perspective. So
the reframing comes to mind with Chester Elton when he talked about his son bringing home pictures that he was drawing in school as a child that were, not great pieces of art. And so what did they do? They took the new drawing today and they threw it up on the refrigerator in place of the old one, but without any conversation.
This looks great,
Yeah, nice job.
Great job.
Yeah. But when he turned it into a yes and I'm maybe retrofitting here on Chester, but when he turned it into so tell me about this. What were you drawing here? Oh, I see that there's a family. Is this us? Oh, and
yes. And tell me about this. It's this opening things up for people to have conversations. And I'm going to go back to John Levy. We are going back to all these old episodes in here, but John Levy, who again, I've just been enthralled with this concept of, hey, the quality of our life is determined by the conversations that we have and who we have them with. So yes, and opens up the opportunity to have those types of conversations, real, powerful conversations, as opposed to conversations where one side wins and other people get cut down, or that you're too busy to be thinking about this. Yes, and opens up that possibility for greater conversations. So
yes, and if you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to give us a nice rating on this as well. And we thank you. We are always grateful for you listening in, and we hope that this week you go out and find your groove.